Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Negotiation. On today's show, we speak with Joshua Eisenman, Associate Professor at the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame and a Senior Fellow for China Studies at the American Foreign Policy Council in Washington, D.C. This show takes us deep into the relationship China has with both the developed world and the developing world. We look at the current state of affairs and try to explain the path it has taken over the last 40 years. I asked Joshua whether the PRC treats different areas of the developing world differently and how the One Belt One Road initiative fits in with their global strategy. Joshua also talks about why we shouldn't see China stretching their reach as necessarily worrisome to other countries or politicians and why. We end the discussion discussing what global organizations can learn from China's efforts in bridging the divide between the developing and the developed worlds. Enjoy.
The greater China's power is within that particular society and context, it also increases its transparency and knowledge of what's going on within that particular society. For China, the point is, or for the Communist Party of China, the point is to develop its relations with as many high-quality parties throughout the world as possible in order to enhance your relational power and build your network and your comprehensive national strength.
Home to over 4 billion people, the Asia-Pacific region boasts one of the most powerful consumer markets on the planet. Not only is it home to half the world's under 30 population, but it's also home to more than half the world's internet users. It's a market no globally minded brand should ignore, but entering markets like China is no easy task. Just ask the likes of Microsoft, Google, Uber, and Facebook. Times are changing, and with the right partners, doors are slowly opening as more and more companies find success expanding into the markets of the Middle Kingdom. I myself spent 8 years in China, mostly as a venture capitalist, helping early-stage tech companies enter the Asia-Pacific market successfully. This show is dedicated to uncovering and examining successful China entry and growth strategies by interviewing the people behind those success stories. My name is Todd Embley, and welcome to The Negotiation, brought to you by WPIC Marketing and Technologies.
Joshua, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on today.
Well, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Why don't we start by learning a little bit more about your background and how you became involved with China?
I'm currently a professor at Notre Dame and a senior fellow at the American Foreign Policy Council. And I came about this as a student in Washington, D.C. At about the time China was being evaluated for its permanent normal trade status, by the U.S. Congress. And so I was a young undergraduate at the time in the late 90s, kind of watching this process unfold. I became fascinated with it, fascinated with the role of China, the emergence of China, and also with Chinese history and Chinese culture. So I went to China in my junior year to study archaeology. I studied it. I enjoyed it. But what was going on above ground was far more interesting in 1998 when I was there. And so I began studying Chinese contemporary politics and economics and went on to do my master's and went to the Hopkins Nanjing Center, which is a great program I hope many of your listeners can look into and maybe attend in the future, at a joint program with the Johns Hopkins University and Nanjing University in 2001 too. So, and it was from there that I really decided that I was going to work on China for the rest of my career if possible. And the question was how and in what context. And so I went on to work in several think tanks and on the Hill, the Capitol Hill that is, before deciding to go for academia. So that's my long story.
You've written a couple of books, and I'd like to take the opportunity to ask you about where the books came from, who commissioned them, who came up with the ideas, the process of the discovery and the research, and how long it took you to bring those to market.
Yeah, so on the topic of China and the developing world, I've published 3 books and with one now in the works. And so the first book, China and the Developing World, Beijing Strategy for the 21st Century, which came out in 2007 with Routledge. That book was an edited volume and the first of its kind in nearly 2 decades. I did it along with Eric Higginbotham, who's at MIT, and Derek Mitchell, Ambassador Derek Mitchell, who is currently the president of NDI, the National Democratic Institute, formerly U.S. ambassador to Myanmar, Burma. So we three, and this was before his ambassadorship, we three put together this edited volume where we looked at the different regions of the developing world. We told the kind of gave some background explanation of what they were about, and then we chose people who were real experts, a diverse group of experts who really knew about China's relations in those particular regions. And we chose those regions not based on our own particular assumptions, but rather based on the formulation of the Chinese foreign ministry and the Chinese ministries and how they engage with these regions. They do it through kind of regional portfolios, not unlike the way the State Department and others do. And so there's a kind of a context there that's not driven by us as scholars, but rather by the way that China organizes its engagement. Of course, there's a long history of China in the developing world dating back to the Mao era, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, I believe. The second book was done in 2012 by myself and Ambassador David Shin. That book was done for the University of Pennsylvania Press, and it's called China and Africa, A Century of Engagement. And that process, Ambassador David Shin is a former U.S. ambassador to Ethiopia and Burkina Faso, served on the continent for decades. So he's a senior Africanist, and I'm a more junior, or at least I was at that point, a more junior sinologist. And so we came together to put that book together. And that book looks at all the thematic issues in China-Africa relations from 1911 to 2011. So a century of relations from the founding of modern China to the end of the Hu Jintao era, the beginning of the Xi Jinping era. And so that book, some have called it the Encyclopedia of China-Africa Relations. Actually, I'm very proud to say, after many years of effort, is being translated and will be published in a few months from the Chinese University of Hong Kong Press. And that's an updated, revised, but not censored version. And I took great pains to ensure that this would be a non-censored version. So,
wow, congratulations.
Yeah, that was a lot of effort, a lot of time to make sure, that was going to not have to come under the red pen. And then the third book is called China Steps Out, Beijing's Major Power Engagement in the Developing World. And in many ways, that's a decade later rewrite of the first book. So the first book published in 2007, this later book published 2018, January, looks 10 years later at those relationships. And of course, all the chapters are rewritten. This time it's me and Eric Higginbotham, because Ambassador Mitchell was serving at the time, but Ambassador Mitchell does contribute a chapter to that volume, and it's again by Routledge. And that was a great effort. I think it's a much better book than the first version because it's a social science book. It's not a conference volume. Me and Eric and I were very diligent about making sure that people answered a very certain set of questions, and those questions remained the same, which allowed us at the end to pull the threads together and make connections across regions, to make comparative analysis across regions to explain China's behavior throughout the developing world, not just in one particular region, but to join together and explain the similarities and differences across regions. And now a new book that Ambassador Shin and I are doing right now is about the China-Africa security and political relationship, because that is the relationship, or the part of the relationship, that is really growing the fastest, that we see the Communist Party of China and we see the People's Liberation Army really expanding their linkages in Africa. And of course, this is a kind of microcosm of what we've seen in other areas of the developing world. So for those who are interested in Africa, which is of course an important region of the developing world, I think there are a lot of things you can understand from that set of relationships that are travelable, if you will, to other developing regions. So that's the work that I've done on this particular topic. I also wrote a book called Red China's Green Revolution. And that book looks at how China itself went about agricultural growth during the Mao era. But that's a different topic.
We're going to talk about Africa. We're going to talk about the One Belt, One Road a little bit later. But just broadly speaking, how would you characterize China's relationship with the developing world right now?
It's certainly emerging and re-emerging. It's becoming more and more important. And this is very different than many IR theorists would expect. They might say China as a rising power is very interested in its engagement with the United States and other large powers. And that is true, but it's not the whole story. And the way that China has engaged the developing world, I think, is not the way that traditional Western IR theory would predict that it did, but still, its relations with the developing world in many ways are an important factor in its relations with major countries. That being said, let me step back for a second and categorize these relations, if I might. The way that I think of China's relations with African countries and almost all developing countries, with the exception of perhaps India, is what I call comprehensive asymmetry. What that means is that China has asymmetric advantage. It is more powerful and larger than all the developing countries on three measures. The international level, so comprehensive national strength, you think of, military, size of economy, total amount of population, et cetera. The state level, where it's got state capacity, state structures, and coordination, which are in excess of almost all developing countries. And at the working or human level, where officials' training and preparation exceeds that of their interlocutors on the other side. So taken together, these three asymmetries are manifest in terms of imbalances in flows of trade, capital aid, as well as the resources available to policymakers, which in turn constrain the developing countries' knowledge and options. So it's really this kind of interlocking asymmetry which dominates the relationship. And so, but it's not, for example, necessary that it be the case. For instance, we could examine the case of, say, Singapore, Israel, where these are countries which on the international level have less comprehensive national strength than China, but perhaps on the state level and the working level are actually better coordinated and have advantages. But in the developing world, that's not the case. And so China really can dominate its relations with developing countries. It holds this real power, particularly in bilateral relations, which it tends to pursue with developing countries. So that's how I would kind of categorize the broader relationship with the developing world.
How has that relationship potentially changed over the last 40 years and then maybe the last 20 years? And what has propagated these changes?
The developing world, or what was known as the Third World, played a really important role for China during the Mao era. And that was because China was isolated diplomatically, caught between the imperialist U.S., quote unquote, and the revisionist Soviet Union, quote unquote. The revolutionary Chinese under Mao Zedong sought to gain friends and influence people throughout the developing nations of the world and brandish their credentials as revolutionaries and bemoan others for either their imperial or revisionist tendencies. And so this was a really important aspect of it. The Afro-Asian or the Asia-Afro conferences in the 60s and Zhou Enlai's famous 1963 or 62 trip to Africa, very important kind of cornerstone, touchstone moments. Of course, the Bandung Conference as well in 1953, where China was reaching out and trying to claim leadership among a community of developing nations. And in doing so, to kind of establish itself and gain credibility on the stage. And this, in many ways, culminates in China resuming its position in the UN Security Council with the support of many developing nations, African nations in particular. Then during the Deng era, we see that developing nations took on a less important role in Chinese foreign policy, where China began to focus on overseas Chinese communities in the West, overseas Chinese communities in Taiwan and Hong Kong, building economic linkages with the United States and Europe and markets. During that period, China's relations with the developing world were minimized and not seen as important I would say this begins to change in about the year 2000 with the establishment of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, which then leads to the establishment of numerous other multinational forums which are created by China to engage entire developing regions, whether it be Latin America or Arab states, as I said, Africa, now Eastern Europe, etc. So ASEAN in Southeast Asia. So this beginning to engage these nations, but on China's terms and through the institutions and the agenda that China is setting, is really a major change. And this begins under the Jiang Zemin era with this kind of going out policy that China begins to pursue. And it evolves, but it remains consistent over the Hu Jintao era. And then it really explodes in the Xi Jinping era, under the One Belt, One Road or Belt and Road or initiative. And this expansion, this rapid expansion of China's engagement with the developing world is really like nothing we've seen before. But where it is really interesting and where it kind of has reminiscences of the past is that its focus on what the Chinese call multipolarity and the democratization of international relations are both intended to constrain the United States and to provide additional support for China around the world. And so in this way, it does harken back to the past, the idea that you engage with the developing world in order to constrain or to take on the U.S. in this case. And so for China, the BRICS, for example, are really important kind of nodes of multipolarity, as they call it, in which, if they are brought together, can constrain U.S. unilateral behavior. At least that's the thinking. Democratization of international relations is about the kind of Gulliver strategy that many developing countries come together to kind of change the norms of international relations in ways that constrain the U.S. So it's not to say that the developing world is important for unimportant for its own right. It has its own value, particularly in economic terms. But in terms of the way China views the geopolitics of the world right now, the most important value of developing countries is as force multipliers in China's relations and an attempt to rise as a major power in the world today.
As you said, China is now in a position where they can set the agenda of relationships with different areas of the world. Do you believe that PRC treats different parts of the developing world differently compared to Africa, compared to Southeast Asia, compared to Central America or to North America, for instance?
So China certainly recognizes differences in regions and nations. And it regularly mentions this importance of these local considerations. And they regularly talk about how, for example, Chinese lessons learned in China cannot be just wholesale enacted in other parts of the developing world without first ensuring that local conditions are understood. So this is a kind of mantra that we often hear. And so definitely you have a recognition on the Chinese side that there is not a kind of one-size-fits-all model or approach to engagement with the developing world. On the Chinese side, you also have, as you do in other countries, people who worked in certain areas being transferred into other areas. And so their experiences in those previous postings, working on those other regions, may help to determine how they view issues in other regions. If you're posted in Central America or working on Central American portfolio at length, and then you're moved to Sub-Saharan African portfolio, the lessons you learned from the previous may influence the way you behave. And so this is, I think, certainly something we see. It's not a uniquely Chinese phenomenon, but path dependence in terms of behavior is certainly something we see. There is also, I would say, it's kind of a certain set of initiatives which are common, and you will see not identical but similarities in the way that the initiatives are carried out across the developing world. And the BRI is the Belt and Road Initiative is the clearest example of this, where you have a debt-driven finance strategy based on China's Exim Bank and the Silk Road Fund and the China Development Bank. And in many ways, that approach approach originates in Africa, decade before. I'm not saying it hadn't been employed elsewhere, but China was employing that in Sudan and Angola in the early 2000s. So we see that strategy, which was seen to be effective, then spread and deployed elsewhere in the developing world. And so you do have what I would call a smorgasbord approach, or a packaged approach, where those countries could come to China and say, well, we want a little bit of this, we don't want that. But what is actually in the smorgasbord is Chinese determined, and you can kind of take elements of it, but it's very hard to kind of create new elements of it if the Chinese side is not interested, if that makes sense. Now, there is another important driver of the similarity in the relations that China develops across these regions. And that is that the way that China views its relations is in terms of something that you could consider, or is called relational power, which means that it expands its network of contacts because the larger and the stronger and the more well-developed that network is, the greater China's power is within that particular society and context. It also increases its transparency and knowledge of what's going on within that particular society. For China, the point is, or for the Communist Party of China, the point is to develop its relations with as many high-quality parties throughout the world as possible in order to enhance your relational power and build your network and your comprehensive national strength. So that means that there are similarities then that we can note. For example, in the International Department of the Communist Party of China, it has specific divisions for each one of these regional areas, and certainly they deploy a similar set of techniques, host diplomacy, cadre training, etc. And so there are some similarities then that we can see in terms of the tactics and approaches that are used by the Chinese side.
Can you explain a little bit about how you see the One Belt, One Road initiative and how that fits into PRC's strategy with the developing world, including Africa?
I mean, this is a very important question because, like all things, BRI has evolved. What it began as was a debt-driven finance strategy to enhance infrastructure development throughout the developing world. And as I said before, a lot of that approach began in Africa, and then was deployed elsewhere. However, it's expanded in numerous ways that have now essentially rendered it indistinguishable from China's overall strategy from the developing world. So let me explain further. So BRI did not initially include Africa. It did not include certain places. It did not include Latin America, but it does now, which is to say that the initial strategy was a primarily Asia-based strategy, if not entirely Asia-based. And it is now beyond that. It is maybe it included a maritime Silk Road stop in Kenya or Djibouti, but it did not include, Nigeria, Congo, and these other places which are now part of the strategy. So it's now expanded geographically to include all areas of the developing world. Topically, it has gone beyond simple infrastructure construction to the development of, first high-tech infrastructure, not just roads and bridges, but 5G networks and facial recognition software and, all types of different security and, all types of, what they call the smart cities strategy has been nested into the Belt and Road Initiative, become indistinguishable again from it, so that China's spread of 5G through Huawei is part of the Belt and Road. There's really no way to separate it from that. And so there's an expansion in terms of what the Belt and Road includes and the topics. And I would also say there's an expansion in terms of the ambition of it. And this goes to the geography and also the topics, but just the general objectives of it seem to be just really intensified. So this is not just about building out infrastructure. It's also about creating a new world order to some degree. And maybe that was the original intention, or maybe it's kind of just grown. But in terms of China's strategy with the developing world, it now becomes indistinguishable from BRI. BRI is China's strategy in the developing world. And so what's interesting is that BRI, now that it's reaching out to Italy and all these other places, is essentially linking China's strategy with the developing world to China's strategy with the developed world. And it is also tying together China to developing countries financially and politically, and bringing them directly under China's influence. So I would say, there was a point where BRI was a portion of China in the developing world, but I would say that circle has grown so large that it now essentially overshadows China in the developing world. It encompasses China in the developing world. So, so I guess the question now is, if BRI has become everything, has it become nothing? I don't know. From a conceptual perspective, if BRI has come to dominate China's foreign policy to that degree, well, then it seems that Xi Jinping and his allies have been successful in ensuring that BRI is the fundamental conceptual framework for all of China's foreign policy. So it's difficult to discuss Belt and Road Initiative. For example, just the other day, I think a batch of masks appeared in Italy from China, and it was part of the quote the health Belt and Road, or something like that. So conceptually, there is almost nothing that does not touch on the BRI initiative in some way, shape, or form at this time.
I know that some other countries and people I know are a little bit uneasy about how swiftly and how far and how easily China is starting to reach and have influence in relationships through its One Belt, One Road. Can you talk those people off the ledge of unease in that this is not something that the world needs to be worried about as far as trying to assert a dominance of power?
China does not want to take the rewards, if you will, of its economic ascent and hand them over to these countries and not get paid back. It wants everything. It wants the benefit of the political bump that comes with giving a loan. It wants to be paid back, and it wants to enhance the relationship. This is not a giveaway, because that itself is an unsustainable approach to engaging these countries. So what they want to do is establish a kind of dependency relationship, but to steal an old phrase. But what they do not want to do, in my opinion, at this point anyway, is to indebt these countries to the extent that they spook other countries from engaging China, or they forestall future types of engagements, economic, right? Because it's very important to perceive of this in the Chinese context. And this is Professor Chinya Chang at the China Foreign Affairs University wrote a book on relationality, published by Cambridge University Press not too long ago. What he talks about is this development of a relationship through renqing. And renqing is kind of like a favor, where I do you a favor, and then you owe me a favor.
Sounds like
and
guanxi.
It's only. Yeah, it's like guanxi, but when I do a renqing for you, then it's up to you to know that you have to return that renqing to me, and then it's through this development of our relationship, where I do favors for you and you do favors for me, that we build our relationship together to our mutual common benefit and our mutual good. So this is, I think, how China sees these relationships, and so it would be perhaps short-sighted to call in loans the way a banker on Wall Street might, in a very short-sighted way. And in fact, China would rather renegotiate those loans out and keep the relationship, which to them is perhaps more important. So from those criticisms that China has received from its engagement in Malaysia, from Mohammed Mahathir, from other engagements that have not gone very well, you can see that when it receives this kind of pushback, its first inclination is rarely to say, call in the loan, In fact, it would rather portray itself as a benevolent partner, a large, powerful, yet benevolent partner, in order to maintain all of the sunken costs of the relationship, all of those wrenching, all of those favors that have been done. They're all gone if you destroy the relationship, and the relational power created is dissipated and is of no value to you is China. So there would be little value from a strategic perspective to destroy the relationship and get paid back your money if the money to you is relatively small and the relationship is relatively important. But at the same time, you can't create a moral hazard problem by simply handing out checks unsustainably. So you need to find a balance between this. And so this is, I think, what's the best way to conceive of the relationship. Because if every country that borrowed money from China defaulted on the debt, gave up its ports. I mean, when Sri Lanka gave the 99-year lease of Port Hambantota to China, the uproar that one incident caused. Imagine if that were multiplied 3, 4, 5 times. The public diplomacy of it would almost be enough to forestall any future development of BRI.
True.
So I agree with you that may be in the backs of some people's minds, but I think it would be too smart by half. It would be destroying the golden goose.
Good way of putting it.
Destroy the golden goose, because you'd get that money, but it would be worthless in the long term because you destroy the BRI concept.
Okay, last topic to tie it all together. What do global organizations and businesses in particular need to know about China's efforts in the developing world?
I would say the most important thing to know is that this is just the beginning. This is we have finished stage one. Stage one was basically 2000 to 2020. And now we are graduated into a much more mature Chinese relationship with these developing countries. In many ways, you could almost think of there being a pre-stage one, a kind of, a real 1.0 being these era of revolutionary movements when China, as I said at the beginning of the podcast, supported these under Mao, supported these revolutionary movements. And then you can graduate to a 2.0 since 2000. And now we're actually moving into a 3.0. A kind of a more mature relationship that China's developed with these nations. And so China is going to become an increasingly important trade partner, an increasingly important political partner and military partner. And I would focus especially on the second and third, the politics and the security. I think that's where the relationship is going in the future. Technology as well through 5G. We may have seen, I wouldn't say a peak of the economic relationship in terms of trade, but maybe a plateauing of the trade relationship. And instead, what we're going to see is more close political relations between political parties in the developing world and the Communist Party of China, closer security relations between the People's Liberation Army and militaries in the developing world. And an expansion of China's efforts to influence and alter the global international order. And this may take place in large part through the provision of public goods, or what China depicts as public goods, although when it comes to its core national interests, or what it calls its core national interests of the South China Sea, Tibet, Taiwan, etc., those things will remain unchanged. But in many ways, China is going to work on this soft influence approach. And I'm specifically not saying soft power, because I consider that not a government-driven effort. But in China's effort, this kind of soft influence approach, the use of outward-focused propaganda efforts in particular, we're going to see increased quite a lot in the developing world. Telling a good Chinese story is what President Xi Jinping called it, and I think we're going to be seeing more of that. In terms of the businesses and global organizations, I think the important thing for them to know, if they don't know it already, is that is this concept that we'd mentioned before of renting. And that when, a Chinese partner does a favor for you, it's in the context of expecting that you would do one for them in return, that one hand is going to wash the other, and that you'll be in their Rolodex and they may call on you to do a favor. And if you don't do that favor, then you will feel guilt and shame, and you may not have another favor done for you in return. And therefore there is a pressure on you. And so that essentially the point I'm driving home is, if you're an organization or a business with dealing with China, that this is the kind of engagement you should be expecting, because it's kind of rooted, as Chinya Chen talks about it, in the Confucian cultural community of China. And so, as you engage China, you should be prepared to be part of this kind of relationship, and to understand that by accepting a favor, you are in fact, I wouldn't say committing yourself, but to some degree committing yourself to either doing a favor in return, or to the shame and guilt that's associated with not being able to fulfill that renqing circle, to Huan renqing. So I think it's an important concept, and I think Professor Chinya Chen's work on this is an interesting addition to the literature. So I think it helps us to understand how China engages organizations and actors in the international relations space, and why it's important for us to understand why China is so interested in preserving relationships, even when in the short term it seems that those relationships are actually doing it financial harm. And so I think that that's a kind of maybe an important way to think about it. And I think one other thing I will leave your listeners with, and that is never to forget that the Communist Party of China is a political organization first and foremost, that it has economic means, it has political means, and it has military means to achieving its political objectives. But its objectives are always political. And those political objectives, first and foremost, include controlling China. But now they are expanding to other issues and other elements as well. So to never misunderstand and believe that simply because you went to Harvard Business School and he went to Harvard Business School, that you both have the same objective. Chinese businessmen ultimately are under the leadership of the Communist Party of China, whether they wish to admit it or not. And your listeners that are businesses in particular should be well to keep that in mind, and to never assume or ask of their Chinese interlocutors to be able to do things, or to assume that Chinese interlocutors can do things that are beyond what the party would prescribe them to do. And this gets directly to the issue of Huawei claiming that it doesn't have to answer to the Chinese government, which of course it does. Of course it does. Maybe I'll leave you with that. And thank you very much for having me here today.
Joshua, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. Thank you so much for coming on today.
My pleasure.
Growing a company is hard. Doing it in a foreign market? Exponentially so. The best piece of advice I can give you is not to do it alone. When you start looking across the pond for further expansion possibilities, and I sincerely hope that you do, make sure you choose the right partners to do it with. My good friends at WPIC Marketing and Technologies have almost 20 years of experience helping brands just like yours enter China. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Negotiation, and if you're interested in being a guest or want to connect with me or any of our team, please reach out to us at podcast@wpic.co, and be sure to rate, comment, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. 再见。